What's happening in Minnesota right now is being described as an immigration crackdown, but that framing is doing a lot of work to hide what's actually going on. Immigration is part of this story, but it is not the core of it. What federal investigators are uncovering is a systemic fraud problem that has been growing quietly for years, protected by bureaucracy, politics, and the assumption that nobody would ever really look too closely. The Department of Homeland Security says it's targeting what it calls the worst of the worst, and that phrase keeps getting repeated in headlines. But when you look at the agencies involved, DHS, ICE, the FBI, financial crimes units, it becomes obvious that this is not about a few bad actors slipping through the cracks. Federal agencies do not deploy at this scale unless they believe an entire system has failed, and that's exactly what investigators are now saying happened in Minnesota. Before we continue with this operation, if you can take a quick second, YouTube is not the biggest fan of content like this, but we believe people deserve to hear the truth. If you agree, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us beat the algorithm and keep going. We really appreciate the support. What makes this situation different from a normal fraud investigation is how long it went on and how many layers it passed through without stopping. Some of the individuals now being arrested are not recent arrivals. They're not people who just crossed the border last year. In several documented cases, they've had removal orders against them for nearly 20 years. That doesn't happen because of a clerical error. It happens when enforcement is deprioritized for political reasons, when follow-up disappears, and when systems quietly assume that once someone is inside, nobody will ever seriously challenge their status again. At first, state officials said there was no fraud at all. Then they acknowledged there might be fraud, but insisted it had nothing to do with immigration. Then DHS ran its own analysis, and the entire narrative fell apart. Federal investigators now say that roughly half of the visa cases they reviewed showed indicators of fraud, not confusion, not technical mistakes, fraud. False statements, misrepresentation, applications that never should have cleared under any serious vetting standard. Once that happens, everything downstream breaks because the system is built on trust between agencies. One office assumes the other did its job. Benefits get approved, licenses get issued, payments go out automatically, and once money starts flowing, the system becomes very resistant to stopping itself. Nobody wants to admit they were wrong, and nobody wants to be responsible for pulling the plug. This is where the scale becomes impossible to ignore. Early estimates suggested the exposure was in the hundreds of millions. Then investigators started isolating individual programs, and the numbers climbed fast. One housing assistance program that was originally projected to cost a few $1 million ballooned past $100 million in just a few years. There was no corresponding population surge, no massive humanitarian emergency, just money moving faster than oversight, and nobody stepping in to ask why. As investigators widened the lens, the pattern became obvious. Different programs, same behavior. Fake providers, inflated billing, services charged for people who didn't exist, entire paper populations created to justify payouts. When fraud shows up everywhere at once, the problem isn't one clever scheme, it's a system that stopped asking basic questions. Then came the part that made this politically radioactive. Photos began circulating, and these weren't leaks or secret recordings. They were public images, fundraisers, community events, political gatherings. People, now under federal investigation, standing next to elected officials who claim they had no idea anything was wrong. Nobody is saying those officials have been charged, and that matters. But access matters too. Fraud doesn't scale in isolation. It scales when it's protected, normalized, or quietly ignored. One of the most prominent fraud hubs uncovered so far was tied to a Minneapolis restaurant, accused of serving as a front for feeding programs involving children who never existed. That same location was also used for political events. Again, that is not proof of criminal guilt by itself, but it is proof that warning signs were visible long before arrests were made. This wasn't hidden in some back alley, it happened out in the open. What makes this even harder to defend is that while these investigations were already underway, the state continued expanding benefit programs. One of the most controversial is Minnesota's Paid Leave Initiative, which allows residents to receive 12 weeks of paid leave funded by the state, with eligibility written so broadly that meaningful verification becomes extremely difficult. Supporters frame it as compassion. Critics point out that without guardrails, it creates exactly the same conditions that allowed the earlier fraud to explode. This is when investigators started using a term that should concern everyone: fraud migration. As one program comes under scrutiny, applications spike somewhere else. When meal programs get audited, disability services surge. When Medicaid billing gets flagged, housing claims climb. This is not random. It's adaptive behavior. It's the same logic you see in organized financial crime. When one revenue stream tightens, you move to another before the door closes. Some of the people involved have already fled the country. Others stayed, convinced the system would protect them. That assumption is now collapsing. Governor Tim Walz has responded publicly, saying the state is taking the issue seriously and that audits are underway. He says Minnesota will soon have a clearer picture than it's ever had. But timing matters here. By late 2025, this is no longer hypothetical. And just months earlier, Walz was a national political figure who came very close to becoming vice president of the United States. That matters because power changes enforcement dynamics. It's a fair question to ask whether these investigations would look the same if the people alleged to have benefited from this system were running the federal government. Would ICE, DHS, and the FBI be descending on Minnesota with this level of intensity? That's not a partisan accusation. It's a structural question, and it's one federal investigators quietly think about all the time. What we're seeing now is full federal alignment: immigration enforcement, benefits fraud, financial crimes, pandemic loan abuse, all being examined at the same time. That doesn't happen unless internal thresholds are crossed. And once that happens, politics starts to matter a lot less than math. There's another layer to this that people keep trying to dodge. You cannot completely separate this story from immigration policy. That does not mean immigrants are the problem. It means verification failures are. If a country expands access to benefits while weakening scrutiny at entry points, the system invites exploitation. That's not ideology, that's incentives. Economists have warned about this for decades. Once eligibility expands faster than enforcement, fraud stops being a risk and starts being a guarantee. Minnesota may simply be the first place where the scale became too large to hide. That's why federal agencies are watching this so closely, because if similar structures exist elsewhere, and many do, this isn't just a Minnesota problem, it's a blueprint that turns compassion into currency and bureaucracy into cover. And the real victims here aren't abstract taxpayers. They're Americans who actually need help, people struggling with rent, healthcare, and food costs in an economy that's already stretched thin. Every fraudulent dollar paid is a legitimate dollar denied, and over time, that denial compounds into real hardship for people who did nothing wrong. What happens next is predictable. More arrests, more indictments, more audits. Some narratives will collapse under evidence. Others will fight until courtrooms force clarity. But this investigation isn't going away. Because once federal data starts telling a consistent story, no amount of messaging can reverse it. This isn't about left versus right, it's about systems that failed, incentives that warped, and consequences that were delayed far too long.